The Dane and Derek Show is an uncensored, unfiltered podcast. Content warnings can be found in the episode description. Hello and welcome to the Dane and Derek Show, a podcast where two nerdy friends attempt to keep in touch and shoot the shit. I am Derek, a writer, director, and occasional D&D player, and with me, as always, is the one and only Dane Fogdell.
Hey, I'm Dane. I'm a writer, musician, and podcaster, and I'm a lover of tabletop RPGs.
This episode, we came up with the idea a couple weeks ago about the topic of dialogue. And so for our icebreaker this week, Dane, what is your favorite line of dialogue ever? And if you don't have it yet, I can go first.
Oh, no, I have it. Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die.
Oh,
Done.
So good.
Love that line of dialogue. It's the whole character distilled. It's a funny line. It's a meaningful line. It's arguably the climax of the movie. And it's repeated like 8 or 9 times, and it doesn't get old. It gets better. And it's also kind of, in some ways, the pinnacle of what dialogue can be to me. So, which I can kind of get into later. So I'll let you go, and I'll explain a little bit more why it's kind of the pinnacle of dialogue for me in some ways.
Sounds good. I had a really hard time with this one because, as people know, I'm not the biggest fan of dialogue, just because it's so hard to get right. But if I had to pick, at the end of the movie Boy, one of the characters asks their dad, "How is Japan?" And after going through that whole 90 minutes, hearing that question that is completely absurd given everything that's happened to them, it leaves you with a sense of warmth and comfort that is surprising after watching the movie. So that's for, yeah. Which, going into dialogue, I having a dialogue about dialogue, I found that almost all of my favorite lines are accompanied by a lot of space between actions, or the dialogue is less important than the expression on the actor's face before or after what is said. Like, another example that comes to mind is I'm a Jedi, like my father before me. What makes that scene great is because he throws away the lightsaber and stands defiant in front of the Emperor in episode 6. It's not that he says that line, you know? What about you? What are your opinions on dialogue?
So I adore dialogue. And to be clear, I adore dialogue in basically any medium. And also on top of that, as a writer, I enjoy writing dialogue over any other part of writing. I would rather write dialogue than description of a situation, such that I sometimes worry that my writing is too heavy on that, and that I'm not even sure that dialogue is necessarily even my strength. I'm not sure I'm all that good at it, really. The thing, I just enjoy writing it, and I enjoy listening to good dialogue. And the thing that I like about dialogue, anyways, there's a series of movies that I can't remember the titles of, but the whole movie is basically just one long conversation between two characters.
The Before series by Richard Linklater.
Yes.
Before sunrise, before sunset,
and before midnight.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, thank goodness. So those movies, their dialogue, I actually don't particularly care for. That dialogue is often, it's not stilted by any stretch of the imagination. In its own way, it's impressive and cool, but it's not what I love that dialogue can do. It is trying very, very hard to be realistic. And I actually don't care for that. I don't super care for overly realistic dialogue. You're never going to recreate it. You can't. And you can't do it while conveying a good story. For example, potentially Derek just edited out about 2 to 3 right? Because that's annoying and it doesn't actually help convey what I'm saying. That might be gone. It might not be. I don't properly know. But well, yet you the listener would know. But anyways, the thing about actually spoken language in conversations is it's really messy and it's not conducive to storytelling. In any medium, dialogue is like the perfection of speaking in a sense when done well. It's the things you can't actually say with the proper timing. There's no perfect joke. You don't get to say the perfect comeback line. You don't get to say to give the perfect speech at the right moment, right? But in dialogue you can make that happen because all storytelling is about telling the truth and not giving the facts, if that makes sense. You're trying to convey a true moment, a true feeling, but you're never really going to fully convey exactitude of any kind. And so I often find the attempt to do so, to try and create dialogue that sounds super lifelike, it tends to land poorly. Whereas if you try to give your dialogue life, it often is much more magical and in some ways much more real. And so like the line I said, like, "Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die." It's a perfect line to me because it's unbelievably true. There are moments in life where someone has just deeply wronged you, and there's nothing they can say, there's nothing they can do. They might not even know who the fuck you are, but they hurt you. And there's just this like feeling over and over again, and you're never going to be able to say the right thing in that way, but it's captured in that moment. And also it's hilarious. It's hilarious as it repeats. And then near the end, when he keeps saying it after he's been stabbed 7 times, it then becomes moving. But that's not a real thing that anybody would ever say. So my opinion on dialogue is basically it's at its best when it's kind of accepting that whatever's happening in the medium, in the book, in the movie, in the video game, it's not real life. And in that way, you can make it much larger than life and capture something. And I really enjoy I personally just enjoy writing dialogue. But that's not true for you. You and I have had this conversation before. You don't like writing dialogue.
Yeah. When I first got into film, I heard the expression that if you can say it in a page, say it in a line, and if you can say it in a line, say it in a look. And I really took that to heart, and I still really truly believe that. But I also think my dislike of dialogue came from, I think, being attracted to more visually demanding movies that aren't like Before Sunrise, Before Sunset, Before Midnight, movies that aren't like anything Joe Swanberg, where everything's heavily improvised to sound more lifelike. I was really into like science fiction films and fantasy films and films that, you know, had lots of visual effects and explosions and stuff like that. And so, you know, and there's very little dialogue in those movies. And if there is dialogue, it's usually expositional, which is sometimes, in my opinion, the worst kind of dialogue to have, because then you're just reciting facts. You're not reciting truth, like you said. And I think that is when I get really tired and bored of dialogue. Dialogue enables you to make truth powerful and to make it perfection and to make it larger than life. I think that there's 2 camps of dialogue that a lot of artists adhere to, and there's the camp that you and I have just described, but then there's the camp of realism and emulating realism and making the audience feel like it could have really been a real conversation word for word. And I think both are valid approaches. Both have their things that make them interesting. But I have to agree with you that if I'm going to use dialogue as a tool in my arsenal, because dialogue at the end of the day is a tool, like any other part of art, if you overuse dialogue, it can be bad just as much as if you underuse it. It's just as much a part of that Swiss Army knife that is creating art, especially film. You know, I firmly believe that when dialogue is written and spoken and performed or read, it needs to make the audience feel something. it can't just make them listen. It can't just be words on a page, for lack of a better way to put it.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, I'm not personally like super against like realistic dialogue, quote unquote. I guess what I'm I guess what more of what I'm saying is I just don't really believe in dialogue that isn't constructed in some way. Like, even if it is hyper realistic dialogue with a lots of open space for the actors to improvise and work around, right? That's a construction. That's a choice. And in that way, sometimes it also has its own quirks of larger than life ness in a sense, because those films often are super meandering
Mm-hmm.
in ways that even life isn't
Yeah,
sometimes, and so I think, but it's trying to capture that feeling often, right? It's trying to capture like, oh, it's me. And so I think maybe the more accurate way I could say what I believe is your dialogue needs a purpose.
correct.
It really does. And there's lots of ways to go about it. I personally really love larger than life dialogue. Like I love help me out, Edgar Wright, when in his films, the dialogue and the way it's done there, how snappy it is wonderful. Or Wes Anderson, which is often really understated dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
Like those like characters will say something just horrifically poignant or painful or dark in just the most monotone, quiet way, and I love all of that as much as I love Aragorn throwing out a speech in front of the Black Gates of Mordor, right? Like all of those things feel much larger than life to me. In the same way that actually Before Midnight and the Before trilogy is also larger than life. Like nobody talks that long.
Mm-hmm.
Not really.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
like you need a break. Like yes and no. But like in the same hand, like it's interesting that way.
yeah. Well, I guess that's the thing, right? It's all of these uses of dialogue construct larger than life movies. It's just sometimes the dialogue is what's larger than life, and sometimes it's the feeling that's larger than life, or the situation or the likelihood of these people meeting is larger than life. Like what makes, Before Midnight in that whole trilogy and all the movies after that have copied it like so popular is that it's the fantasy of meeting the perfect stranger just as much as, you know, like Luke Skywalker giving a great speech, or Aragorn at the Black Gates, or the end of Blade Runner. All of those are like momentous, sort of like is the dialogue is almost the thesis in a way.
Right. It's the fantasy of being able to say the exact right thing at the right time.
Yeah, and it all, and like I said, it's all a tool, right? Like you overuse dialogue to describe things that could be felt, or to describe things that could be like in a look, or describe things that could be a description or a footnote or an offhanded sentence in a story, or I think there's like I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but as a since you are a person that writes novels, for you, instead of dialogue, perhaps your Swiss Army knife is the different vocabulary and words that you have at your disposal to describe things.
Yeah, there's a lot of different options. You're talking about how like you can give a look. There's ways you can break up dialogue. There's ways of putting dialogue on the page, and then there is also the choice of when to, like, there's that old adage of like show don't tell. On the one hand, that's really true. Show a lot of things, but you also do need to tell stuff. Like let's take Lord of the Rings for an example, right? You can't tell or show every single step on an endlessly long foot journey. You cannot do it. No one will stick with you. You have to tell them, the audience, the reader, that they crossed they crossed some distance, and you can go into some detail there, but you do need to tell them that. You don't need to laboriously describe every moment, And so figuring out the moments in which to really slow down and zoom in on stuff, and when to zoom out and just kind of like gloss over things, is something that I personally kind of struggle with, and something that I'm trying to get better at, and specifically to kind of like circle it back to dialogue, because I like writing dialogue so much, I do need to work a little harder on personally going back and taking a look at things like, did this really need to be a whole conversation there, or did I just want to write a conversation? Could this have just been a little bit of description and maybe one or two lines and then moved on? That whole thing that you're talking about, where it's like, just a page, make it a line. If it can be a line, make it a, right, like the constantly paring down is something that I have a lot of in my system. Like I'm a lover of brevity, brevity in basically anything I find to be particularly poignant and beautiful. The one thing I will say, having worked on novel length projects, there are times where you do need to let it breathe, though, too.
Mm-hmm.
Simply because that's the medium, right? If you're working on a feature length film or you're working on a novel, it does need to hit a certain length to some extent, right? To be fair, I do. I believe there are some things that are a little bloated. The average speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy novel, too long. If you ask me, too long. I think 100,000 pages is or not 100,000. Like, I think 1,000 pages is a lot to ask of people. I really do. I think the fact that the average blockbuster is, how long is it now? It's like 2.5.
Yeah, like the average Marvel movies, yeah, like 2.5.
Yeah, too long, too much. If and somehow the Marvel movies still feel like crammed in and hectic sometimes. Not important. Not everything needs to go to extreme lengths. But on the other hand, something I also struggle with occasionally is letting myself sit in a moment for a little bit. So there's a lot to consider with that Swiss Army knife, so to speak.
Correct. And that's, I think, the interesting part about telling a story is figuring out where are those moments of breathing, where are those moments of talking. The example I've been using a lot lately, because I was working on this one short about a party, was I can show the audience that the characters are at a party that they clearly don't want to be at. But the audience won't know why the characters are there unless they talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that I had to really, through like 11 drafts of this short film, eventually I figured out the right amount of words to tell the audience exactly why they're there, why they're unhappy, and to show them form a relationship and friendship over the course of 6 pages. And
right,
it's still one of those things where I'm at a point now where I'm rereading it and I'm like, maybe I cut a little too much out of the dialogue. Maybe I need to add a little bit more fluff, but fluff in the sense of the dialogue needs to slow down, because right now it's exactly what it needs to be.
You may not be at exactly what it needs to be. You might be at the bare minimum.
Exactly.
Right?
That's, yeah. I might have exactly what I need to shoot, but I might not have exactly what I need to make the film great.
Right. You're not adding fluff, you're adding space. You're adding,
yeah,
for lack of a better term, you're adding something by not cutting it, if that makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah, because that's something that I think everyone forgets, is like we're taught to cut and cut and cut, but
especially in film.
Especially in film.
Oh, more than any other medium I've ever done anything in, film is the one that believes that more needs to be cut.
Correct. Like, but that said, people overwrite all the time and people overshoot all the time. And I think there's almost all of the films that I've really liked in the last year or two, those scripts were like 2.5 hours long, but those films are maybe 89 to 95 minutes long. And it just goes to show that it's okay to overshoot, especially if you like plan for it, but know that you got to get things a certain way, because eventually you're going to find the story through whittling it down.
True.
And that's something that, like, you can always have more. You can never create more from less. And that's something that as a storyteller, I've really struggled with, because I constantly try to cut things down to a look. Things like a feature or even a short can end up being so compressed that it's not an accurate representation of what it might actually look like on the screen.
Right. And I will say, personally, a philosophy I have as a creator is I would rather be an amazing editor than a fantastic creator, if that makes sense. Like,
Interesting.
I would much rather. So I just finished a novel length project.
Ooh,
Uh,
congrats.
Thank you. I would say, as it is right now, this isn't me being like hard on myself. I enjoyed doing it. I liked the story. It's probably not going to go much further than this because it was basically a practice project, but it's pretty bad right now. It's pretty bad.
Mm-hmm.
But I have it, right? Like, I didn't go back and edit every chapter trying to make each chapter perfect the first time. I have it. I have the finished thing, and now I can fix it. I would rather have a mess and make it into something lovely than spend forever trying to make things perfect the first time,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense. Um, and so, like, the one thing I usually try and get right, though, is I try and get the concept right and I try and get the vibe correct and the goal.
Mm.
Those three things. Like, if I can get the concept, the goal, and the vibe right on the first try, normally I finish the project. If one of those things is off, typically the project falls through for me and I'm like, okay, gotta move on. Which actually I keep circling back to dialogue. I like dialogue, so that's why I keep circling back to it. I often approach a project with something in mind. When I'm talking about the goal is like, in some ways it's like, what's the feature of this? Like, what's the focus? Some projects, dialogue is the draw. One of my very favorite projects I've done in a long time called Sin and Lavender. It's mostly about the dialogue interactions between the two main characters. I wanted to just write pretty dialogue that felt very real and conveyed a lot of emotion,
Mm-hmm.
and that would be the thing that the whole that everything else hung on. Like, you don't go see Star Wars for the dialogue.
Right.
Even in the well-written ones, you don't do that. You know, it hangs on the broader overarching archetypical story, and it hangs on the visuals and the excitement, right? Like, that's what that
Mm-hmm.
hangs on. Trying to going into a project with what the dialogue should be is really important to me.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing what role it should play in the story, as far as like if we go back to that Swiss Army knife, you know, metaphor, there are some tools in the Swiss Army knife that you don't pull out very often, just because you don't need it for the particular job you're doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And trying to and figuring out which thing is the crucial one that you're going to lean on hardest, right? The level of importance to place upon each tool is important going into a project, right? Like, with this film about like a party you're going into, I would put money on it being really important, your dialogue, you know, more than a lot of film
Yeah.
projects that could be done, because you know, there's only so much that can be done visually, in a sense, right? Like, you're not going to lean on, like, it's not a short that builds to an action set piece and then ends, right? It's not a comedy that builds to a very particular joke and then ends. You
Correct.
know, it's a you're trying to catch a moment and to catch thoughts and how people are. And in film, to capture thoughts, typically, unless you're doing a film where like a character can narrate, you don't the only way to get their thoughts is through good acting, good directing, and good dialogue. And it's very interesting. Like, the next project I want to work on is going to lean heavily on dialogue and first person narration. So I'm trying to make sure that those voices are all right, and that when the dialogue shows up, it's lovely to read and lovely to look at on the page. So something I personally like to do with dialogue that is unpopular, um, is I don't like using quotations. And I often don't like using too many dialogue tags. If you're not familiar with that term, um,
Oh, like he said, I said.
yes,
Okay.
um, because if you do it right, you can imply who's speaking,
Uh
and you can just alternate. You can basically put like essentially like a paragraph break between the the speakers to imply that the speaker has changed, and if you've done it right, you'll know who's speaking in the scene. So I try and limit my use of those, and instead of using quotes, I tend to italicize my dialogue, genuinely because I think it's prettier. Like, I just like looking at it on the page better.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'll have to send you some sometime. But
yeah.
it's the tools are, in this case, are going to be about how I'm doing language more than coming up with a super original story, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense, because, coming up with a super original story is just one part of the Swiss Army knife. Having characters that sound like characters and not Dane 1, Dane 2, Dane plus Angst clone 3, like, having characters that sound like, the characters and their names is very important.
Yeah. The idea is to tell a story that's just distinctly in a voice, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, and because I like dialogue, I really do want to lean into it. The project I just finished has way more dialogue in it than it needs. I think I may have said that already. But this next one, I would rather the dialogue be a big draw than a quote unquote thing I'm doing for just that doesn't fit, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know. I want to talk to you about one thing that we haven't really quite touched on with dialogue, with something that you and I adore. But okay, so here's my question about dialogue. We've talked a lot about dialogue in fiction and in film, and we kind of skirted around it in the sense of like stage performances share a lot of similarities with film in particular. Is dialogue in video games, because it's weird in relation to some of these others. Like it's performed like it's often performed like it is in performance pieces, and it's often just read depending on like the scope and age and all these different things of the game, like in a written medium, for example. But there's often player input, or in other ways, the dialogue often happens without the player's control in a medium about the audience being in control. And I find that very interesting. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, prior to playing Supergiant Games' Bastion, as I stare at my giant poster of the kid on my wall, I was I had a pretty sheltered view of video game storytelling, in that I only had played games where dialogue was very lengthy and you had to read it or listen to characters read it pretty monotonely. But after playing Bastion and, kid rages a bit, like that's one of the best lines in the opening 5 minutes of that game, where the omniscient narrator reacts to something you do if you dawdle too long and just hit things. And that sort of interaction that, you build with the narrator who's narrating a story of a character that you play is very, very weird, and it makes it feel like you're in a story, it's being told, but you may or may not have control over where the story goes. And at times that makes the tension in the game really, really good. And I think that that's an interesting tool that they use to build the drama and the tension. Because there are certain parts of the game where there is no narration, there is no sound, and you're just moving through the level, and it's nerve-wracking.
For sure.
There's a lot of games that I think do that now, and there's a lot of games that have gotten really good at the writing. Like, there are tons of games that are, considered movies, like the Uncharted games, for their writing and how they do the cinematics and the sort of humor in it. Other games that are like Masquerade of Song and Shadow, if you've played that.
I have not.
You might like it. It's very much it's a very like mechanics heavy game that I think you'd like. It's got a great cast. Matthew Mercer's in it. Um, but it's very like theatrical, and it feels like you're watching a grand opera almost in terms of how they conduct the rhythm of the dialogue and the language that they use. I think game dialogue in a way almost has to exist to immerse you, because anything you do to take the player out of it, like prompting a player to read dialogue, can inadvertently pull them out of the experience and pull them out of the game. So the more that can be said in game, or the more that can make the player feel like they're part of the world through what they're hearing, is a really good way to immerse people.
Typically, dialogue in video games is, it either comes about in like cutscenes, right? Like it comes about in the moment in the cutscenes where you're not really in control. That's kind of the Uncharted thing, right? And often the dialogue can be really good in that. Like no lies. Or in like your Dragon Age, Mass Effect style games, you'll have dialogue trees, which I often find to be very fun and interesting, but they can take away from flow of performed dialogue, because like dialogue will happen and it stops dead. Everybody has to pause and wait for you, right? Which is a little weird.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, speaking of Dragon Age, I think the best dialogue in Dragon Age comes from your companions who bicker or tease each other or talk in the background while you're traversing spaces in kind of like silence. And that's always very funny and good, and actually feels really natural, because that feels like something that's happened to you, right? You'll be walking somewhere with a couple of friends, and they'll like quip at each other or like dig at each other while you're like doing something else and not part of that conversation. And I think that lands really well. Two things I have seen dialogue done beautifully. Have you played Oxenfree by chance?
I have not.
Okay, so it's basically kind of a Goonies, a little bit more on the horror side, kids lost in the woods, some spooky's happening kind of game.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of close to a point and click adventure, so there's not a lot of like mechanics, but the main thing that you get control over as a player is dialogue bubbles. But the dialogue bubbles pop up before the other characters are done speaking. And if you click on the dialogue bubble, you can interrupt them.
Oh.
Yeah, and they're I believe, if my memory serves, they're colored in a way such that you know roughly what the vibe is going to be, like an angry color or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So you get to control the pace of the conversation. So if you want to let them finish talking, like a very polite person, you can, and then you can like speak. But the other thing is, if you can also miss your moment, you can, like, if you don't pick quick enough, someone else might start speaking, and then your option to speak will go away. Or halfway through, you can do like a big interrupt, but if you let them finish their whole thought, that interrupt will go away and give you different options. That's basically like the crux of the actual game is creating flows of conversation, which I think is awesome. Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is in Persona 5, which is by and large a pretty traditional JRPG, in dialogue options, there are times where you're in a group chat with your friends and you're given the basic dialogue tree option of like, here are your choices to respond to the text that you just got, or the batch of text you just got. And it still pauses and waits for you to answer, but it felt good because it just felt like texting where you get a moment to think about what you say. And I was like, oh, this is cool. This captures a type of dialogue in a really cool way.
Yeah, I guess in a way, video games kind of amalgamate all the forms of dialogue that we experience in film, fiction, theater, and like real life, because it kind of has to immerse you in all of that. So,
yeah. And in the same way that I thought, there was a period of time where the audio diary was like super big in video games. I don't know if you like, because like basically because BioShock did it.
Oh yeah.
And on the one hand, I do really still kind of have like a soft spot for audio diaries in games. But it's typically a pretty contrived way of essentially letting a long string of expositionary exposition
Mm-hmm.
style dialogue get given in a way that doesn't break the world or make somebody just talk at you. Um, and so I think it's really strange world of dialogue, and just for writing in general, writing for games just seems so difficult. Um,
It's like
and
three-dimensional chess.
yeah, basically. Uh, so like I love watching it change and grow,
Mm-hmm.
you know. But I am I do like your mention of Bastion, where
Mm-hmm.
the you can take an action in the game and then the narrator responds. It's not quite dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
but it is good writing.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess maybe that kind of leads to the other thing that's so difficult about dialogue in games is that dialogue requires interaction, right?
Mm-hmm.
A true dialogue happens between not necessarily equals in the sense, but it requires two participants on the same capability, right? Like you can't properly have a dialogue with someone if you don't speak the same language. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you need to find a way to bridge that gap. Someone needs to learn a language, or maybe you pull out a translation app, or uh, any number of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a video game, we're not quite sure how to bridge the gap where the player can truly be in dialogue with the with the game in some ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like uh in Dragon Age, right? You can't voluntarily just turn to your party members and say something. Uh like I think that'd be a really interesting option. Difficult to
Yeah.
implement, of course, but like for if you're going across the land, you could just like press X or whatever, and like a dialogue tree would pop up where you could just say something. I think that might go a long way. Um,
Yeah.
if you can be the one who initiates dialogue
Mm-hmm.
uh, in a more free setting. So I'm super interested to watch that grow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But anyways, I love dialogue. That's me.
Yeah. No, I've come to appreciate dialogue over the years. I've noticed as I've become more comfortable in my own voice and telling the stories that I've been shifting towards and learning how to use it more of a tool and becoming better at making it sound more naturalistic, and less weird, or too quote unquote Derek. um, I think I've come to appreciate it a lot more. Uh, yeah, I think like everything, too much of a too much of a good thing can be a bad thing, but when used well and poignantly, it can really make you remember that scene or that moment. Ultimately, dialogue helps you feel something, and I think that that's important. And that just because you can say it in a look doesn't mean that saying it in a sentence won't make you feel something more.
Right. And that it has its own art to it, right? Like Vizzini, the Sicilian,
Hmm.
at the end of the duel of wits, he says, "You only think I guessed wrong. That's what's so funny. I switched glasses when your back was turned. Ha ha, you fool. You fell victim to one of the classic blunders, the most famous of which is never get involved with the land war in Asia, but only slightly less well known is this: never go in against a Sicilian when death is on the line." And then he dies, right? Like, you can't say that with a look, right? Like there are some bits of dialogue that convey something else that you need, right? Like you can't have Princess Bride without some of the wonderful looks that are exchanged between like uh between Fezzik, played by Andre the Giant, and Inigo Montoya, right? Like they exchange some looks that are amazing that you could never actually properly convey with dialogue, but you also can't get across Vizzini without the dialogue, right? And so I think your discussion about it being a tool in your box and how you use it and how you weight it being so important. I think that's the big thing. if you're a creator to be thinking about. And I just personally enjoy the art of dialogue in and of itself. Um,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. I think dialogue can be fun. I certainly had my fair share of fun writing fun characters with fun dialogue. Um, I mean, not to always harken it back, but Heroics is a great example of that. There's a lot of fun, silly, stupid dialogue that you can't say with a look, or that is more funny because you had it said and the character got cut off because they got punched or hit or
Yeah.
stomped on by a giant or something silly.
Right, right. And I mean, like, that's kind of the thing, right? Like, that's the thing to like that also you kind of come back to, especially in filmmaking, but in anything, is how these things blend together, right? Like you were just saying, like the line is very funny, and then they get punched in the face, and it's even funnier, right? Like the line I just quoted is so funny because then the actor just stops talking dead and then falls over.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like
Yeah.
there's also that like we've been talking about dialogue, but it's not a separate entity, right? Like dialogue is a part of film, and if you take it out, you can't fully separate it, right? Like you can't fully separate this specific part from different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think dialogue is often so focused on, especially in film, because if you look at a script, which is kind of the first form in which a movie exists in some ways, so much of it is dialogue, you know, like on the page. There are rarely huge blocks of just descriptive text in the same way that like you can go pages and pages and pages in a novel without proper dialogue. You know, you can go ages in a video game depending on the right game you're playing without hearing or reading a single word. You know, like Skyrim, for example. If you do the right thing, not counting like menus and uh uh like pick up this flower prompts, you're not going to run into dialogue in the same way. But with film and like stage plays, you really can't escape it um, without it being a very specific sort of piece. You know, like what is it, 2015's Mad Max comes to mind. Very low on dialogue, that movie. Uh, but that's an unusual film, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not even necessarily low on dialogue. It's the main character doesn't really speak, but everybody else speaks quite a bit.
That's true.
And that's like
That's true.
and that's an interesting tool, you know, in the sense that you don't necessarily need the main character to speak, and you don't necessarily need to have that much dialogue, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I mean, I think the dialogue in that film is great when it's used, you know, because it happens and it's so ridiculous when it happens. But
Yes, yes, that one. It's just not heavy on quote unquote conversation,
mm-hmm.
if as a plot driver.
Yeah.
What I will say, though, interesting thing about that movie to me is there's three sorts of like quote unquote primary characters that I can think of, which is there's protagonists, there's point of view characters, um, and there are like main characters.
Mm-hmm.
And those are not always the same person, though they usually are,
Mm-hmm.
right? This might be a topic for another time, but in Mad Max, I'm fairly certain that our main character and our point of view character are Max, but I'm pretty sure the protagonist is Furiosa.
Correct.
And I think that's a really interesting dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
But we should probably talk about that. It has nothing to do with dialogue, but it's just an interesting thing that I think about sometimes, is the difference between those things.
Yeah. Another time.
Another time.
And we are unfortunately out of time this week. But next week, if you swing on by and give this a listen, we'll be talking Magic the Gathering.
Hell yeah.
And we'll also be playing
Hell
a game while talking about it. So be
Fuck
prepared
yeah.
for lots of cussing and cursing.
I'm learning about this at the same time you are. This is awesome.
It'll be good. It'll be good. So yeah, that's it for this week. You can see what movies I'm watching on Letterboxd at Benig-Aiello, and conveniently also at Benig-Aiello everywhere else. Dane, where can we find you and your work?
You can find me on Twitter at Dane_Fogdall, and you can listen to my show Diceology, like the science of dice, on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify. You know, I probably need to put my writing somewhere, but I haven't done that yet, and that's on me.
Ooh, website time. It's that time of the year.
God damn it.
Alrighty. Thanks for hanging with us.
See you later.